Thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you to Colleen Rosenfeld, who is our speaker this evening. And I get the privilege of introducing Colleen, which I'm very excited to do because I've known Colleen for a long time. I think we met in a wonderful graduate class where we read 16th century lyric poetry together with Jeff Dolven. And it was a class that I think has shaped a lot of how we both continue to think and to teach as well. All of the creative imitations that we've been doing in class, current MA students very much resonate with work that we did on that course, as well as work that Lizzie's been doing. So I think that was when we first knew each other, Colleen. Colleen is associate professor at Pomona College in California. We're not feeling too jealous, although it's tempting today. And her PhD is from Rutgers. She has published widely on topics in early modern poetics, including wonderful essays in English literary history, modern philology, English literary Renaissance, and she's written on Othello for the Arden State of Play volume as well. And she's the author of a really fantastic book published by Fordham in 2018 called Indecorous Thinking, Figures of Speech in Early Modern Poetics. Her talk today comes, I believe, from her next book project, and I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about the development of that perhaps in the Q&A, which is titled Seeing Things Otherwise, Variations on Form in Shakespeare and Picasso. And I'm going to hand over to Colleen, who has some images to share and who will get us started. And because I should say we only have one speaker this evening, Colleen's going to talk for, I think, around 45 minutes. And then Lizzie and I will each say a few brief words of response to Colleen's paper. And then we will have more general discussion. We'll open things to the floor. So that's the plan for tonight. Thank you, Colleen.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to both Lizzie and Hannah for the invitation to share my work with you today. I'm so grateful to be here and so appreciative of their work too, both individually and collaboratively on Shakespeare sonnets. It has enriched my thinking about the sonnets and my teaching of the sonnets in recent years. So I'm eager to be here today. For a variety of reasons, some having to do with the pandemic. Even though I've been thinking about this material for a long time, I haven't shared a lot of it with the world. And I'm still figuring out how I want to write this book. So I hope you'll forgive some of the more provisional elements. I have not drawn all the faces of my argument with a clean line, but I'm eager to hear your questions and to think more with you afterwards. My strategy today will be to open up the conceptual ambition of the book, to describe its theoretical through line, and then to drop us down deep into some of Shakespeare's poetry, primarily in the latter half of the talk. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a shout if you can't see it, or if...
That's great, Colleen. We can see that beautifully.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so in the broadest methodological terms, I should say the title of the talk, as you see there, is The Suppositions of Form in Picasso's Las Meninas after Velázquez and Shakespeare's Sonnets. In the broadest methodological terms, I'm interested in the relationship between criticism and variation. I'm interested in how acts of criticism can gain the insight into art objects through describing not only what the work of art is, but also what the work of art might have been. The various possibilities that a work of art assembles and discards, even as those discarded possibilities continue to vibrate alongside the work of art as a kind of penumbra or as an expansive ontology. In his essay Toward a Theory of Style, musicologist Leonard Meyer describes this expansive ontology as the implied structure of the work of art. He writes, "To appreciate fully what something is, to comprehend its significance, is to have some notion, however informal or unformulated, about what it might have been. The implied structure of the work of art includes not only what is realized, but also what frequently remains unrealized, so that the implicative possibilities of the work of art transcend closure. What I would like to think about with you today, largely through the language of supposition, are those implicative possibilities, which interest me both as an object of knowledge for criticism and as a way of knowing for criticism. As we go about the work of describing the work of art, are we also, in an Erasmian sense of the word, offering variations on the work of art? It is with that question in mind that I introduce you to the central theoretical resource for my book, Las Meninas after Velázquez. In 1957, Pablo Picasso sequestered himself on the top floor of his house and painted 58 studies of Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas. One is a detail of the handmaiden, another is a detail of the Infanta. In one, the Infanta is in full figure, and in another, she is in bust. In another, the Infanta's eyes are stacked, one on top of the other, and in yet another, her face is in double profile. In yet another painting, the Infanta circles a vortex that threatens to consume the room by pulling all of its inhabitants, dog, handmaiden, dwarf, candle, into its receding center. Writing about the possibility of this project to his friend Jaime Sabartes, Picasso described his method of variation as a counterfactual thought experiment. Suppose one were to make a literal copy of the Maids of Honor. If it were I, the moment would come when I would say to myself, suppose I moved this figure a little to the right or a little to the left. Almost certainly, I would be tempted to modify the light or arrange it differently in view of the changed position of the figure. The logic of supposition, from the Latin sub meaning under and ponere to place, guides Picasso's thought experiment. And a reversal of the palimpsest and its interplay of erasure and overwriting, Picasso's variations place 58 paintings under the one, as if actualizing a set of possibilities discarded by Velázquez's Las Meninas. Suppose, a little to the left, a little to the right, now the light falls here, now the light falls over there, open this casement, close that door. I describe Picasso's suite of studies as the central theoretical resource for my book because it is my sense that Picasso's variations on Las Meninas shelter a theory of aesthetic form that is more finely attuned to Renaissance celebrations of poetic possibility than those that have dominated early modern studies and for which Michel Foucault's reading of Las Meninas in the Order of Things is paradigmatic. In that essay, Foucault's charismatic reading focuses on the Infanta's arresting glance as it fixes the viewer in a reciprocal system of seeing and being seen, even as that glance also clears out space in the world just outside the painting for the absent monarchs whose reflection appear in a mirror on the back wall. Contested for its technical accuracy by a number of art historians, Foucault's nonetheless powerful reading of this painting has influenced a wide range of interpretations in the field. From accounts of cultural and literary production, think of the discipline of Elizabethan schoolrooms or the architectural fantasies of Jacobean court masks. Foucault's understanding has sustained the field's still dominant account of aesthetic form as the representation of that power which organizes and makes possible all knowledge, but which otherwise cannot be expressed. In Foucault's reading of Las Meninas, the Infanta's forward-facing gaze reduces the composition of the painting to a sovereign true center that lies outside the painting. Insofar as they stand outside the picture and are withdrawn from it in an essential invisibility, Foucault writes that the monarchs provide the center around which the entire representation is ordered. Across his variations, however, Picasso rearranges the Infanta's face. He crucially and repeatedly renders that face a sharp double profile. Instead of looking absolutely straight towards the spectator standing in front of the painting, Picasso's Infanta looks impossibly left and right simultaneously. Picasso transforms a formal tension in the Velázquez, that's the Infanta's arrested turn away from the bucero offered by her handmaiden, into a constitutive paradox of pictorial space. Picasso thereby formally disarticulates the world of the painting from that of the viewer. Because the Infanta's face no longer places the viewer in the singular locus of the absent monarchs, Picasso's variations eliminate the essential void that Foucault understood to underwrite all acts of representation. What can Picasso's variations on Las Meninas teach us about aesthetic form that Foucault could not? In using Picasso to pivot away from Foucauldian models of knowledge production, I may seem to join the chorus of contemporary critics who seek to dissolve a hermeneutics of suspicion and its characteristic reading practices by promoting a range of alternatives, from the surface reading described by Stephen Best, Sharon Marcus, and Heather Love, to Caroline Levine's strategic formalism, or Rita Felsky's post-critical reading. My aim, however, is different. Influenced by the scholarship of Bruno Latour, who has simultaneously energized the dominance of new materialisms in early modern studies, this body of work is largely authorized by a flat ontology. According to this model of the world, form is, as Sandra McPherson writes, nothing more and nothing less than the shape matter, whether a poem or tree takes. But any theory of form that posits the interchangeability of poem and tree cannot account for the peculiar power of supposition, the thought experiment that underwrites Picasso's variations on Velázquez and that describes ways of knowing what, strictly speaking, is not, but may be, or could be, or should be, or would be. And in a kind of parallel set of essays, I take up this category of what may be, could be, should be, or would be from the grammatical perspective of the potential mood, closely related to what we now call the subjunctive. And so you'll hear some of that sort of language as a focus for me in this essay. Another name for the aesthetic rendering of supposition is fiction. Across Picasso's variations and Las Meninas after Velázquez, the Infanta's centrifugal gaze reveals the impossibility of Picasso's pictorial space and vouchsafes the formal disarticulation of art from the world. It is both the methodological and the political gamble of my book that such formal disarticulation does the crucial work of enabling us to imagine that the world can be otherwise than it already is. In the 1987 preface to the reprinting of The Success and Failure of Picasso, art historian John Berger describes what I have been calling Picasso's suppositions as a set of, quote, unchosen possibilities. In the earlier 1965 edition, Berger condemned Picasso's variations on Las Meninas as, quote, a technical exercise that he understood to be symptomatic of the prodigy who never discovered his subject. But in the brief preface that Berger wrote 2 decades later, he ventures a theory of Picasso's field of vision that more adequately accounts for these variations. He writes, Picasso was always aware that anything he saw might have taken a different form, that behind what is visible lie 100 other unchosen visible possibilities. In my talk today, I want to think about how Picasso's suppositions, his variations on Las Meninas, and the formal possibilities those variations actualize, allow us to rethink the work of aesthetic form in early modern studies, and how Picasso's technical exercises, as celebrated rather than condemned, might suggest a new direction for literary criticism more broadly. My talk will fall into 3 parts. In part 1, I want to expand just a little bit on my reading of the Infanta's face in Picasso's variations. In part 2, I will turn to Shakespeare's sonnets and consider the ways in which the poet repeatedly rearranges his face, and especially the orientation of his eyeballs, He rearranges the eyes along anatomical axes that do not correspond to those axes presupposed by the geometrical reconstruction of linear perspective. Linear perspective, of course, being the formal feature that subtends Foucault's tour de force reading of Las Meninas, and which, at least since Erwin Panofsky, has been yoked to the field's account of the historical emergence of subjectivity. In the third and final section of my talk, I'll consider how the rearranged faces in Picasso and Shakespeare share in an Ovidian aesthetic of metamorphosis, and I venture a theory of formal supposition adequate to their shared investment. My book does not tell a story of influence. Neither Picasso's illustrations for Louis Aragon's Hamlet nor his portraits of Shakespeare feature in my analysis. It is the Ovidian aesthetic of transformation that, I argue, fueled both Picasso's and Shakespeare's experiments with aesthetic form. Drawing on material ranging from Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis to Picasso's illustrations of a 1931 French edition of the Metamorphoses, I consider how attention to the contingencies of form permit for the transformation of verbal and visual images across figurative axes. Literary criticism's traditional focus on biography and narrative as organizing principles for Shakespeare's sequence has, I argue, kept us from recognizing how the sonnets might best be read like Picasso's variations, as a series of studies or attempts, now in this sonnet, now in that, to actualize a set of formal possibilities. Okay, are we ready? We're going to begin with part one. Picasso's second variation initiates the double profile that he will modify throughout his series. As Susan Grace Galassi writes, where the Infanta's head pulls gently right and her eyes abruptly left in the original, Picasso responds with a fusion of two interlocking opposing profiles. The top eye, mouth, and chin face right, following the direction of her head, while the bent back profile nose with frontal nostrils points left in the direction of her gaze. The double profile offers one answer to a question that motivates Picasso's attention to the Infanta. How do you represent an action at the moment in which it becomes another action altogether? How do you represent the motion of reaching for a cup with the intention of raising that cup to your lips at the very moment in which that motion transforms into an act of greeting or recognition or acknowledgement? As Svetlana Alpers suggested, the tendency within art history has been to imagine Las Meninas in terms of a historical dramatic event of interruption by supplying plot or narrative to the painting. By splitting the Infanta's forward-facing gaze into an opposing double profile, Picasso's studies compel us to focus instead on the aesthetic event of transformation, where one action or gesture becomes another. Contrast the Infanta's face in variation 2, which is what you have here, with Picasso's study of the Infanta and his fourth variation. Here, Picasso renders motion in the body of the Infanta rather than in her face. In Las Meninas, the Infanta's head turns in a direction other than the one suggested by her body, as if unwinding herself from the top, the Infanta's body has not yet caught up with her head. In variation 4, Picasso makes a subtle but significant change that shuffles motion down into the Infanta's body. In Las Meninas, the Infanta's hand rests gently on her dress as if that dress were a pillow. In variation 4, Picasso's Infanta clutches the edge of her farthingale in a tight fist. It is as if the Infanta is set to send her gown spinning like a hula hoop, the orbit of motion reinforced by the cylindrical form that surrounds her torso. Now, track the Infanta's eyes in variation 2. One eye resembles nothing so much as a ball screwed onto the end of an L-shaped rod. I'm sure there's a more elegant way of putting that, but I haven't figured it out yet. It reminds me of those like models of the solar system that I keep building over and over again with my children. So it is as if that eye prepares to circle the Infanta's face, while the other eye pivots with the Infanta's parted lip, looking away from the vessel, the serving dish, and the hand on which both artifacts hover. This elongated, almond-shaped eye trails its own pupil like the tail of a comet. Contrast this orbiting pair of eyes with those in variation 4, which connect to the Infanta's face from a set of lines that converge at the tip of her nose. There is no motion here. You could not spin this pair of eyes around a central axis. That motion instead belongs to her gown. In variation 2, by contrast, the Infanta's nostrils are the twin suns around which her cosmic face turns. The eyes of the Infanta in double profile look left and right simultaneously because they gaze out on 2 distinct temporal moments and deny the possibility of the sovereign subject that Foucault attributes to Las Meninas. And the sort of representation of a non-linear temporality of 2 different moments at the same time is an idea that I'll turn to at the end of my talk in a reading of Shakespeare's Sonnet 57. So we can kind of keep it banging around in the back of our heads. Across these variations, Picasso plays with the Infanta's double profile. Now her face seems to melt along the edges of her eyes as if they are suspended from a structure that can withstand the gravitational pull of her painted flesh. Now her double profile retains the light and shadow of Velázquez's Infanta, as if shining the light of a single moment across the representation of different moments. Across these variations, however, one feature of the Infanta's face remains more or less consistently in frontal view, the Infanta's dark nostrils. As if to mark the eyes which might have looked out, each of the Infanta's faces displays 2 small dark cavities consistently in parallel alignment with one another, and so in frontal view. This one's my favorite. Variation 7 in the style of the Harlequin mask is an especially interesting example of this. The right-facing profile of the Infanta is complete. The edge of the mask follows the line of her prominent chin and the parted lips we have been trained to recognize since variation 2. And yet the frontal view permitted by the prominent frame of her face suggests that the mask reveals nothing beneath and incorporates that absence as a completion of the mask itself. Variation 7 recasts the paradoxical gaze of the double profile as an interplay of surface and depth. The mask conceals an absence that it simultaneously incorporates as the sign of completion into its own form. Charles Altieri has recently described Picasso's fiction making as exhibiting 3 basic functions. The first, the negation of nature and its imperatives, by which I take him to mean the irreducibility of fiction to the actual world in which it nonetheless exists. 2, the power of form to constitute evidence of an inner life that we offer as an alternative to any satisfaction in capturing the reality of objects, by which I take him to mean that in granting one, we also grant aesthetic form the power to pose an alternative to the actual world and its imperatives. And 3, the testing of the powers of an artist to make visible the working of that inner life as it elaborates metamorphic extensions of the world given to us, by which I take him to mean that the power of aesthetic form lies not merely in the formal disarticulation of art from the actual world, but also in its capacity to elaborate metamorphic extensions of the world given to us. These 3 basic principles of fiction making, by shorthand, let's refer to them as 1, the irreducibility of art to the world, 2, art as an alternative to the world, and 3, the metamorphic logic, which promises that insofar as art offers an alternative to the world to which it is not reducible, it also might have the power to transform the world by displacing its imperatives. This seems to me like an adequate account of one strain of Renaissance aesthetic theory that values fiction precisely for, in modal terms, its capacity to limn the subjunctive as a realm over and against history's indicative, an indicative that, as Altieri suggests, becomes ideological imperative when turned natural. For both Altieri and Picasso, the subjectivity of the singular artist is central. I, however, want to think about how the work of fiction, the crucial work of imagining alternatives as metamorphic extensions of the world, is manifest in the act of variation. As a series of formal suppositions, variations are not an expression of individualism, but the technological engine of a counterfactual thought experiment in which Picasso raises what is merely possible to the level of actuality. Departing from Altieri's emphasis on inner life and the model of subjectivity to which it is indebted, I argue that the crucial conceptual work of Picasso's variations is the metamorphic relation that they posit between their suppositions and the historical world implied by Velázquez's pictorial space. Picasso in Las Meninas after Velázquez and Shakespeare in his sonnets encourage us to value art not for the fixed necessity of its form. This is the idea that the value of the work of art derives from the fact that it is what it is and could be nothing else. But these variations and Shakespeare's sonnets encourage us to value art instead for the traces of alternative trajectories that they lay bare and for aesthetic form's imminent capacity for transformation. Aesthetic form therefore nourishes a habit of mind, as Picasso would later describe it, to see things otherwise. Part 2, the poet's face. I turn now to Shakespeare's sonnets, where I would like to think about this interplay between the artist's field of vision on the one hand and the acts of supposition that this field of vision permit on the other. Oh, I see. I think I'm host, so I'm also letting people in. I have to remember that. I am especially interested in moments when the poet rearranges his face and more particularly the orientation of his eyeballs. What are the ways of seeing articulated by these anatomical reorganizations, and what forms of thinking do they permit? Take, for example, the opening of Sonnet 113. Since I left you, mine eye is in my mind, and that which governs me to go about doth part his function and is partly blind, seems seeing, but effectually is out. The poet declares that his eyeball has retreated into his skull, or that his skull has retracted his eyeball like a cat retracts its claws. As Stephen Booth writes, the poet, quote, initiates a grotesque image of a person who looks cockeyed because one of his eyes looks out and the other is literally turned around in its socket and looks in. Recall the eyes of Venus upon viewing the gored body of Adonis. Quote, her eyes as murdered with the view, like stars ashamed of day, themselves withdrew. Comparing her eyes to the snail who shrinks backwards in his shelly cave with pain, that poem describes how her eyes are fled into the deep, dark cabins of her head. In Sonnet 113, this apparent withdrawal is complicated by an asymmetry that is further subdivided when the poet reveals that the outward-facing eye effectually is out. The outward-facing eyeball is a ruse. Its only function is to make the world believe that it sees when, in fact, it seems seeing. The poet's eye delivers no form to the heart, no form of bird, no form of flower, no form of shape. But this absence of form, surprisingly, is a thing on which the heart might latch. The heart then proceeds to make of no form his lover. Again and again and again, it shapes them to your feature. Sonnet 114 will briefly entertain the possibility that the conversion of no form on which the heart latches into the lover's feature is a kind of alchemy. To make of monsters and things indigest such cherubins as your sweet self resemble. Though the poet rejects this explanation, I want to hold on to the possibility that the poet's anatomical rearrangement of his face and the field of vision it opens up is precisely what permits for an act of poiesis that remakes the world along unlikely axes of relation. In Shakespeare's Living Art, Rosalie Colleen suggested that this pair of sonnets, quote, demonstrate the poet's metaphorical powers at work. We see the image-making practices at work, she writes. Watch the poet watching his own figuring forth in verse. What I notice is that while Colleen's focus on metaphor turns on tropological substitution, Shakespeare's language is about collecting and collating. In Sonnet 114, the poet's eye is like the sun of its own universe because its beams assemble a collection of things indigest in order to make just one face again and again and again. In a 17th century drawing manual entitled Graphic or the Most Ancient and Excellent Art of Drawing and Limning, Henry Peacham describes the impossibility of defining the term variety. The act of definition presupposes that the object being defined is finite, but Peacham says, variety is various, and the rules of it so difficult that to define or describe it were as to draw one picture which should resemble all the faces of the world, changing itself like Proteus into all shapes. Peacham here suggests that variety is the exact opposite of the critical principle at work in Shakespeare's sonnets. The poet's heart latches onto no form and makes out of that absence a single feature over and over again. Variety, by contrast, consists of creating a single feature which contains all the features in existence, which has the capacity to become now this and now that, and still this other feature. But what if these two faces are one? Is this what Sonnet 93 calls love's face? So shall I live, supposing thou art true, like a deceived husband. So love's face may still seem love to me, though altered new. Variation is not, as far as I can tell, a word of common currency in the history of sonnet criticism. Variant, however, is the bread and butter of Shakespeare textual studies. In fact, the heart's capacity to latch onto no form and shape that absence into the lover's feature is an invention of Shakespeare's modern editors. In the notorious mess of the 1609 quarto, Sonnet 113 declares that the poet's eye delivers no form to the heart that it doth lack. The poet sees nothing but that of which his heart is already replete. The heart takes in only what it already knows. While modern editors admit that the 1609 lack makes sense within the syntax of this sonnet, this sense then functions as historical explanation for why it appears in lieu of what they deem the more probable latch, which they invented. Lack makes sense, but it does not make form. Lack departs from the sonnet's rhyme scheme. At the very moment in which Sonnet 113 describes the poet's incapacity to know anything other than what he already knows, anything that his heart lacks, the critical tradition substitutes a variant that secures a mechanism for apprehending or seizing or grasping what the poet declares to be beyond his understanding, latch. It might be useful to recover the possibility of lack and to allow for aesthetic form what Sonnet 114 calls things indigest, an allusion to Ovid's language of creation at the opening of the Metamorphoses, where the poet sets to work with chaos rudis indigestaque moles, or a rough, unordered mass of things. According to this Ovidian aesthetic of metamorphosis, the rudest and deformitous creature of Sonnet 113 are significant not because they sit to one side of an aesthetic antithesis, but because they have the capacity to become more than one thing. This is to run the word deformity back through the medieval Latin disforma, where it means of diverse forms. This is how Ben Jonson uses the term in Cynthia's Revels, where the figure of amorphous is described as, quote, one so made out of a mixture and shred of forms that himself is truly deformed, which Patrick Cheney describes as, quote, the sublime figure of form that has none. At the close of Sonnet 113, the poet's shape-shifting imagination renders his ein or eyes untrue. My most true mind thus maketh mine untrue. The poet's eyes are thus capable of withdrawing truth from the world so as to see something else. Mine is a pronoun in search of an object to possess, or a pronoun that claims to possess precisely that which is untrue. Or mine swallows the ein in an act of elision that it ultimately subsumes into its first person possession. Part 3, the critic's face. I would like to pull on this thread of aesthetic transformation in Shakespeare's sonnets by returning us briefly to Picasso's variations. Las Meninas, you will remember, features a male dwarf in the lower right-hand corner of the composition. His left foot rests on the hind haunches of a dog, and his right arm is raised, forefinger lifted ever so slightly above the rest. As Elizabeth Bearden writes in the introduction to her 2019 book, Monstrous Kinds, this is not a figure who has garnered much attention from the painting's many critics. Foucault was primarily interested in this figure as the bottom right half of an X that marks the spot of the Infanta's gaze. This is a figure to whom Picasso returns over and over again throughout his series. In the very first painting, his outline frames the white space of the unfinished canvas, as if encircling a potential that is spatially coterminous with the shafts of sunlight entering in through the windows, shedding light on the form of what may yet be painted. In another variation, his figure has the feel of a collage cutout, the single piece missing from an intricate puzzle otherwise fully worked out. In variation 39, the dwarf is a piano player. His raised foot lifts to press a pedal, and the fingers of his right hand bang away at the keys. When asked about this painting, Picasso replied, I saw a little boy with a piano. The piano came into my head and I had to put it somewhere. Such images come to me and I put them in. They are part of the reality of the subject. The surrealists in that way were right. A green parrot is also a green salad and a parrot. He who makes it only a parrot diminishes its reality. A painter who copies a tree blinds himself to the real tree. I see things otherwise. A palm tree can become a horse. Don Quixote could walk into Las Meninas. Picasso's assertion that a green parrot is also a green salad and a parrot harbors a theory of aesthetic form as that principle of abstraction that permits for the reality of the conjunction and. Aesthetic form affirms a reality in which one thing can be both itself and something else, or along an Ovidian axis, a reality which admits for the possibility of metamorphosis. A palm tree can become a horse. It might be useful to recall two paintings barely visible, but in positions of prominence on the back wall of Velázquez's Las Meninas. These two paintings have been identified as copies of works by Rubens, commissioned by Philip IV as illustrations of Ovid's Metamorphoses. One features Minerva punishing Arachne, and the other Apollo's victory over Marcinus. Variation 39, or the piano, is only Picasso's most explicit study of the metamorphic aesthetic that underwrites his suppositions and trains the focus of his variations. By way of conclusion, I want to return to supposition as an alternative explanation for Shakespeare's image making. The metaphorical poetics described by Colleen turns on the substitution of one thing for another. In sonnets 113 and 114, it would be the substitution of a world of the poet's making for the world of actuality. This logic of substitution underwrites an early modern habit of thinking that Catherine Eggert has named disknowledge, which she describes as the peculiar epistemological maneuver of being acquainted with something and being ignorant of it, both at the same time. As with the tropological substitution characteristic of metaphor, disknowledge entails the choice of, quote, the reputedly false over the reputedly true, or, quote, a movement away from the empirically provable and a movement toward the pleasures of the fictive. Eggert's stunning account of disknowledge was published just before the election of Donald Trump. It offers an important prehistory to the forms of thinking that have made possible the post-truth culture of intervening years, from climate change denial to vaccine misinformation. But it is the logic of substitution that distinguishes disknowledge from what I am describing as the suppositions of aesthetic form. Supposition does not replace the actual with the fictive, but instead clears out space in the world for discarded possibilities, thereby rendering those possibilities available as a set of parameters within which aesthetic form might, to remember Altieri, elaborate metamorphic extensions of the world given to us. The category of disknowledge, as Eggert writes, marries the language of metaphoric substitution to a certain laxness about truth claims. Supposition, however, does not replace the actual with what is merely possible. By raising what is merely possible to the level of actuality, it does not loosen the criteria for truth claims, but instead steps outside these criteria to deal in the fictional knowledge of what may be. Suppose is not a word to which Shakespeare frequently turns in the sonnets, though as we see in Sonnet 93, it is part of the poet's lexicon. Sonnet 93 opens with the poet's declaration that the act of supposition is also a way of being in the world. So shall I live, supposing thou art true. Because his lover does not betray his false heart's history through moods and frowns and wrinkles strange, the poet will always only see love's face. The divine imperative that authorizes the poet's supposition is revealed at the Volta. But heaven in thy creation did decree that in thy face sweet love should ever dwell. But the Volta is merely an explanation of the premise that permits for the poem's opening conclusion, so shall I live, supposing thou art true. Even though I know you are false, a natural imperative exists that authorizes me to suppose that your face aligns with your heart, and so I will act as if. The act of supposing thou art true is only possible under the condition that the one doing the work of supposing simultaneously knows that you are not true. It is a statement that withdraws the poet's commitment to truth at the very moment that it names the beloved true. The act or habit of living that this sonnet calls supposing is precisely what allows for the simultaneous declaration and withdrawal of truth. It stands as an alternative to the logical affirmation, even as the poem itself begins in syllogistic media res. What does supposing allow the poet to think that something like the logical affirmation does not? By way of conclusion, I would like to turn to one final sonnet which draws together a poetics of supposition on the one hand and the poet's field of vision on the other. Here is Sonnet 57 in its entirety. Being your slave, what should I do but tend upon the hours and times of your desire? I have no precious time at all to spend, nor services to do till you require. Nor dare I chide the world without end hour, whilst I, my sovereign, watch the clock for you. Nor think the bitterness of absence sour when you have bid your servant once adieu. Nor dare I question with my jealous thought where you may be or your affairs suppose. But like a sad slave, stay and think of naught, save where you are, how happy you make those. So true a fool is love that in your will, though you do anything, he thinks no ill. The modernist poet Basil Bunting is said to have instructed his students by inviting them to cut every superfluous word from Shakespeare's sonnets. Here is an image from an example of this exercise that he performed. If we were to perform Bunting's exercise on Sonnet 57, we might end up with this. These negative formulations, what the poet does not possess, what the poet does not do, the questions the poet does not ask, these negations introduce into the sonnet, of course, everything that the poet does not, as a set of unchosen possibilities, the sort of thinking that catches on where you may be as opposed to where you are, and which the poet in line 10 aligns with the act of supposing. The poet insists with his most famous of puns that his I acts as his sovereign. He trains his gaze exclusively on the clock and thinks of naught, which hovers at the edge of line 11 as an object of knowledge before we get that concessive save. But even as these lines withdraw the very acts of supposition that they describe, they also clear out a space for supposition and limn a more complex temporal experience of the world than what the clock can measure and calculate. This temporal model must accommodate what does not, but might take place. I'd like to conclude finally by directing your attention to that modest, unassuming clause in line 6, my sovereign. Is it an act of address, or does it stand in apposition to I? If my sovereign is a form of address, then the sovereignty of the beloved is also an experience of time. I, the poet, experience your sovereignty over me as I fix on the face of the clock, tracking time until you return, and also on your behalf. I experience your sovereignty over me by tracking time so that you don't have to. If my sovereign, however, is an apposition to I, the first person pronoun that also names the organ responsible for vision, then the poet is divided at the very moment of his consolidation, exercising a sovereignty from which he is excluded because subject. If we think about all that the poet does not do in this poem, those acts of supposition operate outside of the clock that the eye watches. They carve out a distinct temporal experience of the world that revolves around not the historical question of where you are, but the fictional realm of where you may be. Thank you.